Republicans have faced a complex process in agreeing how and when to roll back Obamacare. Repealing the law without a replacement risks leaving millions without health insurance. And on Thursday, President Trump revealed the process's latest timeline.
We're doing Obamacare. We're in final stages. We should be submitting the initial plan in March, early March. For statutory reasons and for budgetary reasons, we have to submit the health care sooner.
Robert Draper is a writer for the New York Times Magazine. He wrote this weekend's cover story, Will Obamacare Really Go Under the Knife? Robert, thank you so much for joining us. It's a fascinating article. I mean, this is some heavy-duty reading, but I encourage everybody who's interested in the battle for Obamacare, how it came to be, and where it's headed to take a look at it on the New York Times website. Let's talk about how we got to this point, where Obamacare went from being a lightning rod issue for Democrats and a rallying cry for Republicans.
Right. Yeah. Well, I mean, the fight to repeal Obamacare began, Vlad, literally the day after the bill was passed. I mean, the day after it, Congressman Steve King, who was kind of a backbench outlier, a congressman from Iowa, introduced the first bill to repeal Obamacare in its entirety before the ink was barely dry on President Obama's signature, signing it into law. That didn't go anywhere, but then when the House of Representatives reverted to the Republicans after the Tea Party wave in 2010, at the beginning of 2011, they began an effort that basically involved about 50 attempts, all of them in vain, from 2011 through 2014, to repeal, defund, delay implementation of certain provisions of or all of Obamacare. But getting every Republican on board was not an organic feat. It actually took a lot of pushing, a lot of doing, and I focus in this story on a particular 501c4 lobbying organization called Heritage Action for America that really led the charge on this.
You profile the folks who run that, and I love how you sort of position the Heritage Foundation, which it's sort of an offshoot of that. Right. You called it like a tweedy, sort of an old school conservative think tank, and this offshoot of it is anything but.
Right. No, there's a Heritage Foundation is this think tank that has been much revered but never feared by Republicans and by conservatives for a long time, and they began to realize that after a while that essentially they weren't, as a 501c3 nonprofit think tank, they weren't really allowed to join the fight. They weren't allowed to campaign for or against a particular bill and throw money behind it. So they created what I call a feral cur of a sort of an attack dog organization whose job it would be, Heritage Actions that is, to hold conservatives to account for their conservative principles. And issue number one, and what today remains their pet issue, is the full repeal of Obamacare.
One of the questions that I typically get on social media from people is people want to understand what the similarities are to the bill that was passed, the Affordable Care Act, and Mitt Romney's health care plan that he implemented when he was governor of Massachusetts.
Well, it's essentially a national version of what then Governor Romney signed into law as governor of Massachusetts in 2006. It's a series of state exchanges, and they both are of state exchanges, in his case, federal exchanges in the case of the Affordable Care Act. The intellectual framework for this had been hatched, ironically, by the Heritage Foundation in 1989 by a Heritage fellow named Stuart Butler. Now, at the time, he was intending it for it to be a private sector solution, but Governor Romney was the first to actually implement it as a governmental solution. And essentially, when other possibilities, such as a single-payer system, such as a public option, failed to muster sufficient congressional support, this is what they were left with.
The individual mandate.
Right.
Right. And so now that President Trump is in office, the rallying cry of repeal and replace has become stronger and louder. The president campaigned on that issue. But are you sensing through your reporting that the appetite for repealing it, and more specifically replacing it among some Republicans, is looking a little murkier than it might have looked like when it was something to campaign against the President Obama.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's when there was an opponent who you could gain points from attacking. I face for this legislation. It was one thing, but now, as Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer has famously said, the dog has caught the bus and isn't sure what to do with the bus. And there are, for one thing, Republican governors in a number of states who have opted for the Medicaid expansion component of Obamacare in their states and are loath to get rid of this.
That's something like 31 states, right?
That's right. Yes, yeah, and about a dozen of those are Republican states, and they've got millions of people on the rolls now as a result of that, and are very reluctant to face the electoral consequences and human consequences that would come from kicking them off. Similarly, there are a lot of people who benefit in Republican states as well as Democratic ones from the provision that allows people with pre-existing conditions to remain on insurance, that allows kids or young adults up to age 26 to be on their parents' insurance.
Which I love how the Heritage Foundation, they call it the slacker option.
Yeah, the slacker mandate, I believe.
The slacker mandate,
yeah, right? Exactly, and it's so Obamacare, for all its warts, has become quite popular. It now has achieved a 50% approval rating, even as it's on its deathbed, and has positively affected the lives of millions of people. So it's changed a paradigm, Vlad, and as Republicans are planning for a replacement scenario, they have to reckon with the fact that that there are now all these millions of people on the rolls that weren't before, and simply increasing incentives for health savings account, tax credits, and the like may not guarantee that those people will stay on the rolls. And again, there are likely to be headlines generated if that fails to materialize.
Yeah, in your piece, you ask the question: have Republicans become trapped by their pledge? That's what you're saying. It's
right.
They've rallied against it for so long. Now it's time to pay the piper.
Well, and no one is more trapped than the person who now owns the post-Obamacare landscape, President Donald Trump. And Donald Trump, as you mentioned, campaigned vigorously against Obamacare, called it a disaster, and said he'd replace it with something terrific. He never specified what that terrific would be. It's notable that the White House has been pretty quiet while these legislative efforts have gone on to figure out precisely what the replacement mechanism would be. There's nothing out there yet that Donald Trump seems to want to put the Trump brand on, to call Trump Care, and in part, I think, because he too has questions about, well, how comprehensive will the solution be? And they're caught between a rock and a hard place. That on the one hand, they don't want a series of bad news stories that would be the consequence of lots of people not being covered by whatever the new proposal is. On the other hand, it can't be Obamacare. They just finished repealing it, so it's got to look different in some ways or other. Precisely how they square this circle remains to be seen.
And they haven't. And have you discovered or talked to any members of the GOP that have anything specific that they can offer?
Sure. Well, Speaker Ryan rolled out this plan that is very heavy on tax credits, on incentivizing health savings accounts. It's unclear, however, what the cost of it will be, how it will be paid for, and for that matter, just how many people will be covered. It also includes, by the way, the elimination of the Medicaid expansion program, and in all likelihood, they will block grant money to the states. But again, that's under almost even the rosiest scenarios, that probably means millions of people will fall off the rolls.
Robert Draper, writing for the New York Times Magazine. Will Obamacare really go under the knife? Great talking to you. Great article. Thank you.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it, Vlad.